we're trying to answer the question today, am I in a relationship where there's emotional or verbal abuse? Is my partner emotionally abusive? Am I emotionally abusive? I get this question a lot, and I'm going to help you answer this question by going over a few things. First, we want to talk about what is verbal abuse, what is emotional abuse. Also, I want to go over some forms of communication that are not really considered abusive, but they are problematic and harmful and disconnecting. Then I'll talk about the signs that you're in an emotionally or verbally abusive relationship, some questions that you can ask yourself. And then most importantly, we're going to talk about how can you respond to it. If you think that you're engaging in abusive behaviors, what you can do, and if your spouse is, and you want help with how to actually navigate that and draw some boundaries, we're going to go over that as well. Now, to be clear, I do make a distinction between abusive behaviors and being an abuser. So a lot of times what gets in the way of people really looking inward and recognizing, you know what, I'm engaging in behaviors that are abusive is because there's so much shame around like, oh, am I an abuser? And they're not the same, okay? So an abuser, when I think of an abuser, I'm thinking of somebody who, based on their personality, based on the structure of their identity, and maybe their trauma history or background or what they grew up with, they must have control to feel safe. So they're essentially very insecure and scared and untrusting, and so they engage in the cycle of abuse in order to maintain control. And so it's a pervasive and very comprehensive behavior pattern that's very predictable. You've got four things. You've got the tension building. That's where you have a breakdown in communication. There's a sense of walking on eggshells. You're a little bit fearful. There's tensions building, right? And then you have the incident. Now, this is like where there's an outburst, a big fight, anger, blaming, threats, intimidation, yelling, that kind of thing. Then phase 3 is reconciliation and apologies. This is the stage of like, I'm so sorry. And there can be genuine remorse in this cycle. And then phase 4, there's the calm period. That's like the honeymoon phase. You've forgotten all about it. You're back to normal and things are great until the tensions start building again and the cycle goes round and round. Okay, so that's an abuser. That's a pattern of control. Whereas if we're talking about abusive behaviors, it's maybe an isolated incident or things that are recurring, but it's not so much an indication of the person's personality structure and their need for power and control. It's more just about it was what they watched growing up and it's the only way they know how to communicate. It is a lack of skill. It is coming from a place of fight or flight. It's coming from maybe there's some trauma there. But if you're willing to say, I'm doing this and this is hurtful and I take full responsibility and I'm not blaming anybody else for my actions, then you're not an abuser. Abusers will tend to always externalize their locus of control and say that this other person behaved in a way that made me do this, because they are actually very disempowered or they wouldn't need to resort to these methods in order to feel in control. So now that I've made that distinction, what are verbally abusive and emotionally abusive behaviors? So verbal abuse involves the use of language to hurt or manipulate or put down the other person in a fight or flight kind of situation. It's characterized by specific tactics that cross the line, that healthy boundary between us, into harm. It doesn't matter if you're intentionally doing it to hurt the other person. An abusive behavior can hurt the other person regardless of your intention. When I think of verbal abuse, I think of name calling and verbal attacks that are like the verbal equivalent of physical abuse. You are battering the other person with your words. Name calling, derogatory labels such as you're calling them stupid, you're calling them selfish, you're painting them in a very broad negative stroke. You're not just giving them feedback and complaining about something, you're actually making it about their character and how they are less than or some kind of defective person. The use of sarcasm and condescension, like, you know what, let me see if I can dumb this down for you. Or how could you not get that? You're sort of making fun of them. Criticism is, like I mentioned, globalizing, attacking someone's character rather than addressing a specific thing that you don't like, hey, I didn't like that you were late. Instead being like, you're always late, you are selfish, you never consider anybody else's feelings. Direct put downs, like where you're really making a statement to demean their worth, like you're nothing without me, nobody else is going to put up with you. Yelling and screaming. This is where you're just in someone's face and you're energetically pinning them against a wall and they can't get away from it. You are literally forcing them to absorb your intense negative energy. And this can happen through unbridled self expression, which is one of the losing strategies that Terry Real talks about. I've been guilty of this where I think I'm being honest, but I'm venting and it's very unbridled. And that is a boundary violation because when it's unbridled, there's no safety. It's like the other person, what are they supposed to do? They're just on the receiving end of it. There's no regard for how the other person is receiving what you're offering, right? And then threats. So if you are using fear, like if you leave, I will hurt myself. That also does veer into emotional abuse, but it's a verbal threat. Or saying, like I mentioned, if you leave, no one else is going to put up with you. That's verbal abuse. It's often about really eroding the other person's self esteem and attacking their dignity. Now, emotional abuse, on the other hand, is more about using someone's emotions and sensitivities and vulnerabilities to control or manipulate them to try to get your needs met through manipulating them emotionally. So, like guilt tripping is a really big example of emotional abuse. You make somebody feel really selfish for not giving you what you want. And there are people that are more susceptible to this than others. If you were raised in an environment where you really did believe that you were selfish, it's going to be very easy to make you feel like you have to do what they want. Otherwise, you're just a selfish person and you're going to be very vulnerable to guilt tripping. Isolating is a form of emotional abuse where you're creating conflict to prevent a partner from spending time with other people. Maybe you feel threatened. They're hanging out with friends that you feel like are getting in their ear about you. And so every time they're going to hang out with somebody that's not you, you sort of trash those people, right? You trash their family, you trash their friends, and it becomes such an argument or a point of conflict every time they spend time with them that they just stop doing it. They have to choose between spending time with their loved ones and having harmony with you because they cannot have both. Whenever somebody's in a situation where they have to choose between those things, that's a really emotionally abusive place to be in, where it's like, I don't have a choice. If I want to keep harmony with my primary partner, I have to sacrifice these other relationships. You can also financially isolate people. People call that its own thing, like it's financial abuse is its own category, but I do think that that's an emotional form of abuse as well because you're removing somebody's autonomy, which is connected to their dignity. Chronic disapproval, constantly creating a hostile environment by vibing negativity. If you're rolling your eyes or scoffing at them or kind of laughing at them or just nothing they say is impressive to you. Everything they say, you're showing how you're really not pleased. Nothing that they say is going to make you happy. Deflection and table turning where you're not taking ownership and you're always blaming them. So if every time your partner tries to give you feedback, and they're really trying to do it in a healthy way, in a non-blaming, non-accusing way. But you just cannot handle it. And so you're going to flip the script and put it right back on them and engage in constant defensive maneuvers. That is a form of emotional abuse, depending on the degree. In and of itself, getting defensive every now and then is not emotionally abusive. But if it's something that you're always doing and you're creating an environment where there really is no room for them to ever share something that you did that had an impact on them without you table turning or putting it back on them, I think of that as emotionally abusive. Same with invalidation, trivializing your partner's concerns all the time, telling them that it's ridiculous. They're ridiculous for feeling that way. Don't be silly. Don't be so sensitive all the time. How could you think that? I can't believe you would think that. Like making them wrong all the time in order to not receive what it is that they're trying to share with you is really damaging to the fabric of trust, emotional trust in the relationship. Also, embarrassing them in public, joking at their expense despite their discomfort. This could be in public in front of strangers at the grocery store, or this could be in a group of friends where they're making you feel embarrassed and humiliated in the presence of others. They're having a laugh at your expense. And if you've told them, hey, that really hurt my feelings, and they continue to do it, and they're making you wrong for taking it personally, and they just insist on doing it, that's absolutely crossing the line and it's emotionally abusive. Very clearly, there's no gray area there for me. Also, gaslighting. This is part of invalidating, but making somebody doubt their reality, especially when you know they're onto something, but you are going to make them doubt their perceptions and deny things that you know are true because you just don't want to give them that power and you don't want to take accountability. And so now they're second guessing that they don't even know what's real anymore. That's for sure emotionally abusive. If you are with somebody that makes you constantly think you're insane for seeing what you're seeing, then you're probably in an abusive relationship. And we'll get to that in a little bit. And then the last thing I want to say about emotional abuse, silent treatment and stonewalling. Again, this is not always intentional, but if you're withholding communication or you're giving the silent treatment because you're afraid of what might come out of your mouth and you're just going to ignore them until you calm down, that is extremely damaging. Now, if you're doing that because you're in fight or flight or in freeze, like, I don't know what to say, I'm going to get it wrong, and you're just so scared to say anything, then you may have your own trauma that needs to be healed. You might not realize how hurtful that is to the other person because in your mind, you're actually trying to protect the relationship. But it is a very dysfunctional way of doing that. It might be the lesser of two evils to stonewall. If you have two choices between stonewalling and verbal abuse, stonewalling is probably a step in the right direction, but it's not where you want to land, right? Ideally, you want to learn how to say what's actually coming up for you in a healthy way. Now, communication that's not necessarily abusive, but that is hurtful, I do feel like I have to give an honorable mention to this type of communication. This is where I consider this destructive, but not necessarily abusive. One of them, I talk about this all the time. I don't really like rhetorical questions that are designed to prove you wrong. If you're like asking them a question so that you're leading them to answer the question in a way where you can make them wrong, right? You're only using the question to make your point. You string them through a series of questions so that you can win an argument. It's not a sincere question. Same with statements that shut down the conversation. Like if they say something and you're like, yeah, you told me this already. There's no room for curiosity. You've completely shut down a bid for connection. That's hurtful. It's not necessarily abusive, but there's no green light to actually have a connection with your partner. And if you do that a lot, every time they're making a bid, they're trying to share something with you, they're noticing something, they're turning toward you, and they want to share something that was on their mind or something they heard, and you're just like dismissing that or telling them you already know that, it's like a door slamming in their face. Also, neutral sounding observations that are actually judgments like, oh, you're late. Oh, I see you parked that way again. Or if you are asking a question that they can't ever answer properly, like, why did you do that? No, really, why did you do that? And then they try to answer it, and then you're like arguing with their answer because their answer isn't going to move the needle. It's not a real question. This is similar to the rhetorical questions. There is no way to answer it correctly. It is just a device to make your point. If you ever find yourself asking a question and then only just sort of deconstructing their answer, it's not a real question. You have a statement to make, and it's better to just make that statement rather than disguising it in a question. Speaking for the other person, assuming their motives or intentions is a boundary violation where you're telling them, oh, I think you did this because of this. You did that because you didn't care, or you give them an analysis and they don't get a chance to say what it actually was for them, and you're not open to what it was for them. You're insisting that your interpretation is correct, and you're stepping out of your lane and you're crossing into their lane and speaking for them. And maybe you're on to something, but if you're insisting, that's just going to put up a wall, right? It's not going to create a sense of safety for them to come into insight around what's going on for them. And then the other thing that I wanted to mention is poking holes in technicality. So this is when you're focusing on the small details instead of the main concern. They bring something up, and instead of hearing the spirit of what their grievance or their request, you're focusing on the technicalities, you're focusing on where they didn't get it just quite right, and making that more important than the spirit of what it is that they're actually trying to communicate. If you've been on the receiving end of that, you know what I mean. The last thing is just sarcasm. When you get digs in and you're really sarcastic and you're using humor to disguise actual criticism, and then when their feelings are hurt by it, you pass it off like they're just overly sensitive when you're not really owning you did have a criticism and you didn't bring it up in the right way and you're trying to pass it off as humor. That can be very hurtful to the other person. And signs that you might be in an abusive relationship. Like just from hearing what I've shared, you might be thinking, yep, I can relate to that. Yep, I've done that. Yes, my spouse has done that. When people ask me the question, how do I know that I'm in an abusive relationship? These are the questions that I ask them to ask themselves. Do you feel afraid to bring up certain topics because of their reaction? Is it going to become extremely emotionally unsafe for you if you bring something up, even if you do it in a really reasonable way? And the second question is, do you feel like you can't do anything right in their eyes? The third question is, are you constantly being blamed for their behavior? So Are you always being told that the reason that they behaved badly was because of something that you did? If all roads lead back to you and it's like, well, I wouldn't have done that if you hadn't done that, and it's always your fault, that's an emotionally abusive relationship, in my opinion. If you are being humiliated or being yelled at, you're in an abusive relationship, if that's just the culture of your relationship. If you are isolated from friends and family because there's going to be hell to pay, that's abusive. This is pretty obvious too if you're being financially controlled, if you're being watched, monitored, your whereabouts, everything is, you have no privacy at all because your partner is afraid that you're cheating on them all the time. To me, that's a big red flag. When I ever hear that, I assume like we're probably dealing with an abusive relationship. Do they control your access to resources? This could be anything at all, including friends and money. And are they threatening you to manipulate you? Are they threatening to use the kids against you if you leave? Are they threatening to tell everybody that you're crazy if you leave? That's abuse. So the more you answer yes to those questions, the more likely it is that you are in an emotionally or verbally abusive relationship. That doesn't necessarily mean that it can't be fixed. But if the person who's engaging in the abusive behaviors is not willing to look at themselves 100%, no matter if somebody else triggered them, they have to be willing to own their response to that. And that is how you can tell if there's hope. If somebody comes to me and says, hey, my partner is emotionally and verbally abusive. Can you help me work on myself so that I can transform this relationship? I will say, look, if this is really truly an abusive relationship, we're dealing with a precondition, and the only way that we can do this is if they join, right? Because I'm always talking about how we can transform the relationship from the inside out on our own without their help. That doesn't apply to preconditions. If you're dealing with an abuser or somebody who has pervasive abusive relationships who's not willing to look at their part, you can't do anything about that. All you can do is hold boundaries. So we're going to get into that in just a second. But the person who's engaging in the abusive behaviors has to be willing to make those changes in order for the relationship to be healthy. So I just want to make that really clear. Now, how do you respond to verbal and emotional abuse if you're on the receiving end of this? First is you have to set some boundaries. Okay, so let's say your partner is engaging in some of these hurtful behaviors. You have to clearly communicate what is okay with you and what is not okay with you. For example, hey, listen, I really want to hear what you have to say, but if you are yelling at me or verbally insulting me, that's not okay. The boundary is when that happens, I will give you one reminder. And if you keep going, I will leave the conversation. So that's the communication of a boundary. Now, to be clear, the boundaries are held by you, not them. It's not enough to just communicate the boundary. You have to follow through and hold that boundary. Expect them to cross the boundary inadvertently or purposely. They're going to cross it at some point. Be ready to hold it. So what that means is the next time it happens, you have to follow through and say, hey, you're yelling and I can't stay in the conversation. If you keep yelling, can you please lower your voice? And if they can't lower their voice, then you leave the conversation. You hold that boundary. If you're in a situation where you cannot leave a conversation because now you are going to be barricaded in a room, or you're going to be followed around, or you're not going to be able to leave because they took your phone, now we're really in an abusive situation where you're not safe and you'd have to be engaging in safety planning. And if that's the case, I will give resources in the Facebook group for this. But the very first thing you have to ask yourself is, what am I okay with and what am I not okay with? Where is the line for me? And I need to articulate what that is. Like if you say, hey, whenever you become verbally abusive, I will do this. They might not know what that actually means. So you have to say, like, when you yell at me, when you call me these names, when you threaten, when you do XYZ, when I hear this happen, when you ask me a rhetorical question and you're arguing with my answers, this is what I will do to hold our boundary, because I won't engage in that any further. That's the most powerful thing that you can do if you're on the receiving end of abusive behaviors. Now, if you're the person who is engaging in abusive behaviors and it's something that you want to stop doing, then what you need to do is look at, before you engage in any kind of response, what is my goal? Am I trying to connect or am I trying to prove a point? Am I looking to make them wrong? Is my intention to catch them in an inconsistency or pin them against the wall energetically? Right? Are you attacking them to defend yourself because you feel aggrieved and so now you're going to come at them really heavy-handed because you're mad? You have to be really aware of that, right? And then not let yourself do that. So you set up your own containing boundary. An internal boundary or a containing boundary is a boundary put on ourselves. I will not yell. I will not allow myself to say hurtful things, right? I will not try to keep talking to them after they have said they need a break. That's what you have to own and really commit to, that self-awareness piece, because sometimes it happens really fast, especially if you grew up in an abusive household and you learned that to survive. That is a knee-jerk response that was conditioned into you before you had a choice. And so be compassionate towards yourself and realizing this was conditioned into me. I didn't choose this, but you are responsible now to recondition, to unlearn it, and to learn new ways. So just always be aware of what your intentions are. Set your intention to be more connecting and healthy. Take time outs. Get curious. Wait until you're cooled off so that you can connect and really understand each other, because you're not going to solve anything when you're in a me versus you mentality. So along the lines too of, if you're on the receiving end of abusive behaviors, you want to withdraw from the dynamic, like I mentioned, if they continue. I want you to think about this as, am I feeding the dynamic that I don't want in my life? Where am I feeding that dynamic? So you ask yourself this question, like, if you don't want to be in an argument where you're always blamed, if you don't want to spend 2 hours in a conversation that goes nowhere, where you're not being heard and they're always putting everything back on you, then you have to find where you can withdraw from that conversation sooner. You don't defend yourself. So if they're coming at you and you've already answered and now they're still coming at you, the only way that you can withdraw from that dynamic is to just no longer engage it in any way, verbally, or not even be in the same room as what this is happening, right? You literally are withdrawing your attention, your physical presence, your mental energy from it. And it's very difficult to do this, especially if you are feeling like, no, I have to protect my reputation and I need to defend myself. And I want them to understand that my intentions weren't bad. We can get really hooked into wanting to make our point. But if you're dealing with someone who is really triggered and activated and they are not hearing you, it's not going to do any good anyway. And you're literally wasting your time and energy. So pull your attention away from the dynamic that is not what you want to be feeding. The other thing you have to recognize is that abuse is a cycle, and the more that you allow it, the more that you participate and stay in it, the more that it continues. And I know that this is not a black and white thing, because there are very real reasons why people stay in abusive relationships that are very real barriers. And I have a lot of compassion for that. If you are physically not unsafe, if you are physically safe, the only barrier is internal, then the good news is that that is something you can fix. Like, you can grow and heal in such a way where you can hold that boundary for yourself without putting yourself into danger. If you're in a relationship where you are going to be in danger by holding boundaries, then you need help with some, you have to actually look at safety planning and get help for you. And couples counseling is not indicated in that situation. And sometimes we do have to get to a point where we're like, I won't be in it. You have to be willing to walk away and actually be willing to leave or lose the very relationship that you want in order to have it in the healthy way. You have to be willing to let it die. And sometimes people that are really stuck in these cycles have to see, like, oh, this person really will leave if I don't grow and evolve and make this healthy. So it's a gift for both of you if you can do that. It's also, I want to let you know that it's a lot more common than you think. And admitting abusive behaviors does not mean that you're beyond help. It doesn't mean that there's no opportunity for redemption or healing or growth. And it's super common. Like, I've engaged in abusive behaviors verbally and emotionally early in my marriage. And I don't fit the category of being an abuser, but I did engage in those behaviors. And it is really humbling when you have to realize that, like, oh my gosh, this is not okay. And I need to establish a zero tolerance policy on myself for that. So there's a theme here. Whether you're the perpetrator or on the receiving end of it, there has to be a very hard line of, like, this is not something that we accept in the culture of our relationship. It's not going to last if you allow it. So just have compassion for yourself and realize that it's not about being bad or good. It's just about what works and what doesn't work, and what's healthy and what's not healthy, and committing to evolving and growing, because it's in the best interest of not only your well-being, but also for the future generations and your children. Now, the very last thing I want to mention, the fifth thing that you have to do in order to navigate an abusive relationship, is to seek support, depending on how bad it is. Reach out to a trusted friend. Sometimes that's not going to work, though. Sometimes you're going to need a support hotline, or you're going to need a therapist, or you're going to need a coach, or somebody who's neutral, because friends and family, sometimes we can't be as honest with them as we want to be, because they're going to get so upset on our behalf. And that isn't always even helpful for us to stay calm and to stay measured. So you have to have a neutral place to talk. And I know this is hard because your partner might be saying, don't air our dirty laundry. But if you are in an abusive situation, you have to have at least one safe person that you are talking about this with, because otherwise you're just in that pattern of isolation. I have to carry this toxic shame all by myself. And if I share this with somebody, then I'm hurting my partner, outing my partner, who I believe is trying to grow and learn. But it's your story too. It impacts you too, and you have the right to share about your story. So just make sure you're very strategic about who you share with. You may not want to share with mutual friends, but you certainly can share with people that are in your corner, that are neutral, that are not involved in your partner's life. Also, if you have been on the receiving end of abusive behaviors, you probably are going to have to do some healing work. Your self-esteem has probably taken a hit. So it's really about, how do I restore my self-esteem? How do I love myself enough so that I can advocate for my best interest? And the more that you can do that and strengthen the inner muscle psychologically and healing and growing your own core beliefs, the stronger you're going to be and the more you're going to be able to stand for the relationship that you're trying to create. And if your partner has it in them to do the work and grow and meet you there, they'll be grateful to you for holding those boundaries. They'll say, you made me a better person by holding these boundaries, and now we could come out the other side and live the true potential that our relationship has. Because there is a reason why we choose our person, and there probably is a lot of love underneath the hurt. If you're even listening to this right now, you're somebody who is really committed to growth and evolution. It's just you have to be on the lookout and be very aware of how you are coming forward to support what your vision is and what your non-negotiables are. And don't settle on your non-negotiables. That's it for today. If you like my content, please take a second and either like this video or subscribe to my channel, or both. That will help us reach the people that really need to hear this stuff.